Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. We're so pleased to have you with us today for the Jewish Press Today, which we're doing in partnership with the Forward. And we're really pleased to have Jody Verdoren from the Forward, Alana Newhouse from Tablet Magazine, and Felissa Kramer from JTA. And joining us to moderate today's conversation, Gal Beckerman from the New York Times Book Review. For those that don't know, YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library of over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which we make available to researchers around the world. In addition to that material, we do a variety of public programs like this one, classes, and exhibitions to bring to life the world of Jewish history and Jewish culture. So we're so pleased to have you joining us today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Gal to moderate today's conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. There is something bittersweet about this because I see three very good friends and we're like separated by Zoom. And it would be so much nicer, as always with these situations, to be sitting in a room together and also feeling the energy of the audience. But I am super excited to talk to the three of you. Again, let me just repeat who you are, just for the people at home. Jody Verdoren, who's the editor-in-chief of The Forward, Alana Newhouse, who's the founder and editor of Tablet Magazine, and Felissa Kramer, who's the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And I pretty much want to just jump into it, but just to give people a sense of why I'm excited about this conversation. It's one that I sort of wanted to have for a while with three of the smartest people on this topic. The Jewish press, when we think about it, we usually think about it in these sort of historic legacy terms as this institution that sort of came up at a moment where American Jews were finding their place in American society. And there was a very distinct function to the paper, to the press back then. These were people who were assimilating into America, were finding their place, and the newspaper sort of gave them a pathway and provided a sort of linchpin for the community. Obviously, American Jews have evolved. The community has evolved in enormous ways over the last 150 years, and yet we still have a Jewish press that's vibrant, that I love reading, that offers so much to people who feel themselves Jewishly affiliated and even people who don't. But I've come to wonder, and this is the sort of bigger question that I want to ask, is sort of what is it for today? And so I guess just to start as sort of an exercise, I thought I would have each of you sort of describe some piece of reporting or an opinion piece or some moment in the recent past where you felt that there is a kind of essential quality to what you do as in terms of Jewish journalism. And I mean, I know that I've had many moments where I found it essential, where I want that angle, but I'm curious to hear kind of what stands out in your mind. And I think that will sort of lay the groundwork for the future conversation. So I'll go in the order of that I see you guys on my screen. So Jody, do you want to kick this off? You're muted, Jody.
It's like, how long will it take for us to master the mute button? I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for moderating, and thanks, YIVO, for hosting. And I had put in the chat that I'm sitting here in the Forward office with the portrait of Ab Kahan, the founding editor, over my shoulder. And I think about your question often. This is my first job in Jewish journalism. I've been an editor for 2 years. Before that, I worked at the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times for my whole career. And I love the kind of essentialness and the role of the Forward in the early part of its history was so clear. And we like to talk about how it trained this generation or generations of Jewish immigrants to be American. And literally there's stuff in the archives. It's literally like how to vote, how to play baseball. Should you let your kid play baseball? And what is what are we for now? And so I love that you're starting the question with that. I think we are, in the midst of a transformation of this publication to meet the diverse needs of our diverse communities. And I think, you mentioned the word affiliated. I think one of the key roles of the Jewish press is for people for whom the kind of organized Jewish world doesn't speak to them directly or, comfortably. And it's for people, people who feel Jewish in all kinds of ways. So I know you asked for one thing. I'm going to tick off a few things because that is my nature. But the first is, at the beginning of the pandemic and really throughout the pandemic, and even before that, when there was in the fall of 2019, when there were several anti-Semitic violent attacks in the New York area, we were really reporting intensively on how COVID and those violent attacks were playing out in the Orthodox communities of Brooklyn. And we were translating that coverage into Yiddish. And we're really the only publication providing independent reporting in Yiddish anywhere. And I think also providing a lot of context to that coverage. In both cases, in the case of the Jersey City shooting, for example, and COVID locus in some of those neighborhoods, it was a part of the story for the national mainstream media, but I think we were able to provide some essential context and deeper reporting. I also felt right after the pandemic started, this is a much softer version of that, but we published a lot of personal essays about the experience of COVID and sort of a lot of publications, but whether it was about people who are starting to be challah for the first time and what that was about, everything about doing Zoom Shiva or Zoom B'nai Mitzvah. And I feel like those things, it wasn't, accountability reporting or investigations. It was really just opening up ways for people to express themselves and connect. And I thought that felt very essential. And then I'll give you two more from 2021. The first is on January 6th, where, again, everybody covering the insurrection at the Capitol and everybody to some extent mentioning the anti-Semitic tropes there and the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt. But we published a piece that day and the next day that was like a guide to the anti-Semitic memes and symbols around the Capitol insurrection that I think went deep, really explained it, and really helped to put that Jewish lens on a national story in a way that nobody else did. I'm reminded, when I first took this job, I was talking to Ben Smith, now the New York Times media columnist, like you, a former Forward person. And I remember saying to him, I want the Forward to be the Jewish New York Times. And he said, but the New York Times is the Jewish New York Times. And that is often the challenge that, Jews are radically overrepresented in the mainstream media. So there's lots of Jewish stories in lots of places. But that was an example of where that was like the 7th paragraph or the 17th paragraph somewhere else. And it was a whole story for us. And the last one I'll mention is this spring, we published a story about Central Synagogue re-investigating sexual misconduct by a very senior rabbi there who went on to lead the Reform Movement Seminary. And it was really about how the Reform Movement had not done a deep enough investigation at the time. And I think that's not a story that would have been reported fully, really, any outside the Jewish press. And I think that was also essential to our communities to open up those reckoning conversations that have now spread across to several movements.
Sorry, now I'm muted. Alana.
I guess one of the things that's, I went to Barnard, and when I started at college, it was 1993, and Columbia University, which Barnard is a women's college it's part of, had gone co-ed had 6 years before, so really, really recently. And there was a lot of conversation on the Barnard campus about whether or not, what the purpose of a women's college was anymore, if we could now go to the larger university. And at Barnard's then new president gave a speech at one point, I think it was my second year, but it might've been my third, where she talked about how actually the need for a women's college was even more important. Because there were no spaces anymore. I don't think she used the term safe spaces, but there were no spaces for uncomfortable, internal, insular conversations that one wanted to have without men, frankly. And that in fact, now that we were allowed in all of these other spaces, it was, it laid down the need even more so for our own protected space. in a funny way, I kind of apply that same idea to Jews and journalism, especially when you see our publications in the history of Jewish journalism in America. Yeah, that's right. The New York Times is the Jewish paper of record. All the more reason for spaces that are not general interest, that are simply covering us in drive-bys, but actually, and that's fine. I actually don't, that is the New York Times job. Contrary to what a lot of Jews believe and what they decide to obsess over every day, the New York Times, it's not the New York Times job to be a Jewish communal outlet or be a Jewish outlet for Jewish identity, culture, and ideas. What that means, though, is that, and then each of us has, the internet flattens all differences between things, but in many ways, the DNA of the Forward is the DNA of a newspaper. The DNA of JTA is a DNA of a wire service, and the DNA of Tablet is DNA of a magazine. And those are three very different genetic makeups. But what I would say that I feel we all have in common is, well, we have a lot of things in common, but one of the things we have in common is that we see that particular corral as the one in which we want to be focused. And that means exploring the eccentricities, the sometimes the problematics, and the wonder of that specific community and that specific universe. In terms of pieces, it's very hard. I guess I have a hard time with that, in part because of the internet. I think the internet is so, it's this gaping maw, and I feel like it just eats things, and the next day, you don't even remember what happened the day before, and it's just, you have to feed it again. It's like, who even knows? I don't even remember what happened this morning. So with that in mind, though, I will say that one of the pieces that I found taught me something about people, the internet, the way that we read now, was the series that we ran a few years ago by Mark Weitzman about what was then emerging anti-Semitism in France. It was a multi-part series that ran in the early fall. And the pieces not only sank like a stone, nobody read them, but I also got a bunch of calls from people at general interest outlets telling me that we were fomenting hysteria. There was no emerging anti-Semitism in France, and Tablet was being Tablet and being and wrong. And the combination of those two, I kind of gave pause. And then, of course, 3 months later, you have the hyper-cacher murders and a slew of anti-Semitic incidents in France that start to be obviously anti-Semitic. The day of the murders, we put up Mark's series, and it became one of the best read series in Tablet's history. Because we published it too early. Or I don't even know if it's too early. I don't even know how to think about it. But what I would say is our readers weren't quite ready to hear it for whatever reason. And so what I learned about that was, A, that it's okay for our connection to readers and experts to not always be perfectly aligned in any given day. It's also okay for us to get things wrong, for us to put out that. I mean, I'm a person who doesn't have a lot of anxiety about putting out things that we are playing with and we're not quite sure about. But I also learned that you can put something out and then it will come back to you as something that was worthy. And so judgment may be sometimes a little bit delayed, which is very, very hard when you're dealing with a communal conversation because people are very, very hot in every given moment. And that's very difficult. So, we have more to say about lots of different specific topics, but I would say that the big difference, a lot of the differences now are just technological and platform, as far as I can feel it.
Yeah. I'm curious to come back on that question of sort of the safe space question. I wish it wasn't such a pejorative
Well, let's
concept
use it
in
as
some
a start.
quarters.
We can use it for the purposes of this call.
But-
At least we can use it for a good thing.
But I think we talked about this years ago. I remember once, just because of the paradox of having, trying to create that space, but also on the internet, everybody being able to look in, and the conflict that creates in terms of what you think about your content. So the piece that you mentioned might have worked within a certain context, for a certain audience, but then once other people are looking in, it becomes a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But we can come back to that. Felissa.
Yeah, I've heard so much that I want to respond to. Hi, everybody. The purpose, why do we do what we do? What is the purpose of a Jewish press? I mean, I think you, Gal, mentioned, we had this press and then we assimilated, and like, do we need it? And Alana, you're talking about, well, we had gender segregation and then we were together, and why did we need it? And there's a hypothesis that, well, we still need that space to talk. I think in both of those cases, it's also clear with the passage of time that like, we're part of things, right? And that but is where our coverage is most needed, and why we need to tell our own stories. And so to me, the reason for existing is very clear, which is that, again, like Alana, I think there's a great value in parachuting in or picking the spot and having that one definitive story in the New York Times. But there's also so much along the way before and after that is of real importance to the people that we cover, and it matters that it's documented too. When I think, and to your point, Alana, about being too early, like that's the best thing that we can do, right? Is identify a trend or document something so that when everybody else gets wise to it, we're there to say, yes, we see you, you're not crazy for thinking this. Here are some tools to understand this thing that's crossed your mind. That's like an experience that I would love to give readers all the time. So, if we publish a story and nobody sees it and then nobody still sees it in the future, like that kind of sucks. But if we publish a story and the moment, arises again, and we've created an asset that can be helpful, like we're really fulfilling our purpose. In terms of a story that I think really speaks to the why and what I'm proud of, I'm gonna pick something that's very different, I think, than anything we've talked about here. And that's a story we published earlier this summer about the sale by the Jewish, the Jewish Theological Seminary of a rare book, which truly, who outside the Jewish press would ever tell that story? And our reporter, Asaf Shalev, really spun that into a tale that explains, how we collectively accumulate knowledge and maintain libraries, and where are we allocating our resources, and who is the captain of what is our story going to be in the future. And a really important story about Jewish institutions and values that if we hadn't done it, maybe one of you would have done it, but nobody else would have. And I'm really proud that that's in the world. And I think that that's a real value. And readers responded to that, which it might seem super arcane and like, who wants to read about this one book? And people ate that up because it really does tell us something about who we are and how we tell our own stories.
Great. Well, I want to ask sort of a fundamental question, because I'm just curious about how you would answer this, and it goes to this issue of audience. So how do you conceive of your audience? And I guess that points to an even bigger question, which is there a we, is there an us anymore? And obviously there's been a lot of thinking about this over many years, but you have to deal with it at a very practical level, which is you're producing content and you're thinking about who it's for. And so at some level, I'm sure you're trying to figure out like, who is the American Jew who's actually wanting to consume this, who is consuming this, and I'm using words like content and consume in a purposely, crass way, because it, you are sort of trying to figure out what you're delivering and to whom you're delivering what you're producing. And so you do have to tackle these bigger questions. So any one of you can jump in, but is there an American Jewish entity anymore that you think about as a unique thing, when you're working out what you're going to report on or what you're going to put in your publications?
Can I offer the cop-out answer? Which is that, of course there is, because the American Jewish entity is a group of people.
Right.
And that's who, like, we wouldn't be successful if we're not thinking about the full sweep of the people. And we're not writing something for every single person in every single community every single day, but at least at JTA, we're thinking about, you know, everyone should feel reflected in the aggregate by our coverage. No one should feel alienated in the aggregate by our coverage. Everyone should learn something new in the aggregate from our coverage. And by taking that approach, it means every story in every community and every niche in the whole range, no matter, you know, whatever metric you're looking at range, like that's all part of the story we're telling. And that's not necessarily a great answer when we're like having a staff meeting deciding what stories to write that day, but it is a galvanizing answer, I think, for feeling like we're doing something really important for the people we're serving.
Let me see if I can just put like a slightly sharpened point on the question, because I remember my days as an opinion editor at the Forward, and there was a moment I feel like where it was like we couldn't really do pieces about the death of various denominations in the American Jewish world because people didn't. It stopped feeling important to enough people, you know, and so there was a sense. But then on the other end of it was like, do we just do pieces about like Jewish celebrities, because that feels like we've gone to the lowest common denominator, you know? And so between the sort of particularity of a Jewish world that you know, maybe what was structured around certain common institutions much more distinctly than it is today, and this sort of amorphous kind of like a feeling of Jewish affinity, you know, that might be what a lot of Jews, American Jews, sort of have today as their Jewish identity. Sort of, where do you find the balance in all of that?
I'll jump into that. I mean, I'll starting with that. I think, you know, Gal, I think to some extent what you're talking about is a much broader shift in journalism that's also much older,
sure.
which is, you know, all of our beats. I remember when I first worked in the Washington Bureau of the LA Times in 1997, there was a discussion going on about whether the historical beat structure, which was all about specific institutions, like what gaps that was leaving. And I think increasingly in the 20 years since then, or almost 20 years since then, a lot of journalism organizations and journalists have been rethinking how they think about what to cover and how to make more coverage that's ground up and more coverage that is maybe it's about power that is not lying in kind of obvious structures and institutions, and what are the gaps between those institutions and what are the cross currents around people who think about those things. And I mean, this comes up in lots of ways. I remember when we were as the New York Times was becoming more digital, and I'm thinking about this as we're redesigning our own website, like, you know, the print sections of the New York Times are named in a certain way that's based on the print sections and on also the way the staff is organized, but it's not really how readers think. And we talked a lot about, like, does national mean anything for people versus like education, religion, politics, or whatever. And so I think that's related to what you're talking about, is like, you know, to some extent, stories about whether a denomination is failing, it's just that, like, it's boring. I mean, it's just like, it's not really how Jewish life is lived for most people. Right. It might be important, but I think the challenge is to understand how would this matter outside of that building or outside of that payroll? Who does it matter to and why? And to kind of conceive stories that way. And I'll just add my own 2 cents about, like, you know, so look, we think of, first of all, I have taken to really thinking about our communities as a plural and not thinking about the Jewish community, but thinking about our kind of diverse Jewish communities, which are of course overlapping. And we, similar to how Felissa described it, I mean, we really believe that the Forward is for every type and stripe of Jew who considers himself Jewish in any way and who's interested in connecting to their Jewish identity in any way. And we want to have on-ramps in all the ways that people connect, which might include celebrities and food and books and religion and institutions, by the way. And I often talk about something similar to what Felissa said. I think, yeah, we want everybody to see themselves reflected in our pages, but also challenged by them. You know, we want people to see something that doesn't reflect their experience and that opens themselves to a new experience too. And I guess the key thing is to be really mindful and thoughtful about like, who is this for? Who is it speaking to? About every individual piece. And they're not going to all speak to everybody, and everybody's not going to see everything, because that's the way the internet works. We don't package it up nicely and give it to a closed audience who have signed up for it. I also just want to mention that in the Pew study that came out earlier this year, I was struck by actually how, I mean, found that 17% of American Jews read Jewish news frequently, and another 25% read sometimes. I think in these kinds of surveys, people often overstate such habits, but that's a lot of people. That's 40-some%, right? Math. 40-some% of, what is it? 6 million, 7 million people reading it sometimes. That's a lot. Yeah. And, I think, how do we serve that vast audience? Like, it's in overlapping chunks and pieces that connect them and that they can find what they're looking for. We publish a series, an occasional series called The Secret Jewish History of Whatever. And I get lots of email about people who hate that. They think this is a totally offensive framing. Why are we looking for Jewish things about non-Jewish things, whatever? And then I also get tons of email, and I see on the audience trackers that people love this stuff. And they really want to know the secret history of the Foo Fighters, which is one of the more recent ones we've done. So, there's a lot of different people, and there's a lot of different stuff to serve their needs. And it's a tricky puzzle, but it's kind of fun.
Mm-hmm. First of all, let me remind people that you can ask questions. We're going to do a little Q&A at the end, but put it in the Q&A box that you see on the, I think, right hand of your Zoom controls. Another thing I wanted to ask, just in terms of sort of your day-to-day and how you think about coverage, Alana mentioned, like, you each have the sort of DNA of newspaper, wire service, magazine, and there are a set of journalistic ethics and a kind of journalistic mission that comes along with each of those. But how do you balance that against sort of a Jewish values or Jewish responsibility? Or do you feel that you need to balance that against like another set of values that you think about, not just the journalistic values? I think, it's a unique question for Jewish journalism, right? And then I guess the next question is, like, do those ever come into conflict? Like, are you, I'm remembering days, at the Forward, where we would do like the hard hitting investigative stuff. And there was always like, at what point are we tipping into just, calling people out too much, or, just this thinking, Lashon hara, people, there is another layer here. Or at least I imagine there is. Maybe you'll tell me that there's not, but I'm curious how you sort of negotiate that.
Let me say two things that may both at least try to get at some of what you're asking. I guess one question that I ask myself, or I try to ask myself, particularly around reported pieces where you're reporting on an individual, especially if that individual is not a public figure, mm-hmm. or is not a well-known figure even inside of your community. Mm-hmm. And the question then, I think, is always, what is your intention? If your intention is to expose or reveal something that you think is important to reveal about the world, I'm not so sure there's another value that comes in conflict with that when we're publishing. But I do think that it is important, and I'm not so sure whether or not my feelings about this would be different outside of a Jewish outlet, frankly. I think it's important to ask whether you're in that story for shaming, or for prurience, or for some, like, what, and again, you can be in a story or interested in a story for a bunch of reasons, but your primary reason kind of has to be the journal, like reporting on something, right?
Right.
To that end, though, I guess, and I don't want to keep sounding like a broken record, but I do really feel like it's very, very hard to have any of these conversations out without talking about what the internet did, both to the Jewish community and to journalism, because it is so, it's almost like we're doing two completely different things. Both of those things were affected, and I guess I would say in a couple of ways. Jody talked about beats before, but beats were also geographical, which is actually the primary way in which people understood their life, right? And often their affiliations. More broadly, one could say that our affiliations 100 years ago were more rigid, meaning if you were a member of a union, you were a member of that union. And that was maybe even a big part of your identity. If you were a member of a town, you were a member of that town. You got the newspaper, you paid taxes there. That was a big part of your identity. One of the things that the internet and changes in the economy has done is it's made our sense of our own identities and affiliations porous and very transient, and they can change day to day. And so you can actually be a member on Facebook of a community of atheist knitters who live on streets that start with the letter D. And like that could be your identity today, even though it's small, or it may not be a big part of who you are, but today it is a big part of who you are. So then the conversation that you're trying to direct people into about Jewishness or Judaism or Jewish history or Jewish life is so strange, and people are coming at it from such different angles. For some people, it is the minorest part of their identity that they're halfway looking at in a rearview mirror. For some people, it's the absolute wallpaper of their whole house. And what that means is that there's a challenge, I think, for each of us, and we each approach it differently, and we approach it differently with different stories. Because the corral that I talked about it's not well defined in any way. And it used to be much better defined, both in reality and for newspapers or the outlets that did it. So I know it's like a roundabout way of answering your question, but in a way I feel like the internet is the thing that we're talking around. It's simply both flattened, expanded, and also kind of like almost like a centrifuge, just like split apart a community into tons of little pieces that make it very hard to wrap your arms around.
Can I respond to that? So I don't know that I would call myself a digital native, but I have not worked in journalism prior to the internet. And I think we have a really like a neat gift in Jewish media. Like I think the phenomenon you're describing, Alana, brings media in line with how Jews are. Like there was never like a geographic, oh, I'm a New York Jew, I'm an Ohio Jew. Like that's not a thing. Like Jews are part of a global community, and the internet knits us back together. So I feel only promise, and I know obviously the internet has some problems. Okay, like I'm on it, I see it, but I feel only promise for the storytelling that we're trying to do, because the opportunity is so there for someone who is usually, the atheist knitter on the streets that starts with D, but like sometimes remembers this thing, and like here we are for you, or for the person who once a year they check into that Facebook group, but most of the time their main identity is their Jewish one. So I feel like this is the moment where we can be there for people the way they're living. It really maps to the project that we're doing.
I actually want to ask a related question, which is, about sort of the way the internet shapes, what you produce. And it's the notion that, social media obviously has its bias towards a certain kind of provocative argument, trolling, is sort of the thing, the most maximal position that's going to get people angry and get them to respond. And again, my days at the opinion section at the Forward, I remember in the best circumstances, it was a place where you could hash out complicated, intense, very personal, touchy issues within the Jewish community on an op-ed page. That's when it worked well, I felt. But there was obviously a drift, and the internet is not a small part of it, towards pieces that just kind of throw flames, and that would seem to exacerbate, the fault lines that already exist in the community. And I wonder how you negotiate that, and how you think about sort of keeping that at bay, or using it to your benefit. I mean, you can talk more broadly about social media too, and sort of how it works into your thinking.
I can start. I mean, I think, you know, we live in the world we live in, and we have the tools we have, and they have flaws, but there's a lot of power in the, you know, the democratization and flattening of the internet that the internet created, that Alana talked about, like, you know, has been so important for individual writers, and frankly for, you know, Tablet as a publication to be able to, you know, find a place and to have, you know, quality rise. And it also obviously has helped a lot of trash rise. I guess for me, you know, I think it's really important to understand what readers want and need, and to therefore pay attention to what they click on. And then I think the other thing is to remember who you are, which is journalists, and, you know, so what are you giving them when they click on something? Is there a way to take a provocative headline, you know, there's something either you're going to make it provocative, or the social media platforms are going to exploit it and make it its most provocative version, but that it actually has quality. I also, I mean, the other way I really try to think about this is, you know, there's a kind of almost a drug notion of clicks and virality and reach, but most of what those kinds of stories produced are empty calories. They're kind of drive-by clicks or readers that never come back, that often don't even know they're reading your publication. And I'm just much more interested in building up an audience of people who are really engaged in what we're doing, and who are not just looking at a social media post, but actually reading a story and coming back multiple times, or tuning in to an event like this one, who are signed up for our newsletter, and we can communicate with over and over again. We can be in conversation with. We're doing more and more call outs to get readers, you know, to react to issues or ideas. And so I guess I think it's like, you can't, I think it's perilous to ignore the signals that you get from the internet or from social media about what people are most interested in and what riles them up. But we should approach that responsibly, to put into that space the best quality and the broadest range of things that we can, that treat different perspectives respectfully, that engage substantively. I mean, I don't do this that much anymore, but I've often, you know, there'll be like some flame thrown at me or my institution on Twitter, and I'll kind of respond with a, you know, good point, was our thinking. And people are totally shocked. Like, what? Like, you're actually gonna be thoughtful around this thing that is all about. But I think that's kind of always the answer, is to bring substance and thoughtfulness and openness to the idea that you were wrong to the conversation. Look, for us, I think the most important metric for a Jewish publication, for our publication, is to be talked about, to be an essential, something that's essential in people's lives, that can build a relationship with them, that they're sharing our content and they're talking about things they heard or read through the forward. And that's hard to measure. There are some things we can measure on that, but that's the goal here, is to get more and more people talking about issues and ideas that matter and that they found in the forward. And social media is a key part of that, but it can also send you real false signals about what people care about and are interested in. And you have to be careful not to like lean in too heavy to these empty calories.
But yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say I want to say that I agree with Jody. I also think that there's a difference between the clickbait trolling and controversial pieces. And, you know, we can talk for a long time about that, but one of the things that came to mind for me was we ran a series of pieces about the response to COVID in ultra-Orthodox communities in the actual spring of 2020. So not in retrospect, but on the ground, including, you know, what are now sort of the well-known pictures of community activists cutting the chains on playgrounds and basically having a challenging or perpendicular response to communal officials' messaging around COVID and what it would mean for their communal life. And one of the things that struck me was that people were angry about that point of view. They were angry that there were Jews who felt this way, which is fine, but that's different than saying that doesn't exist and you've made it up. It does exist. This is actually a viewpoint. You can decide that you want to demonize that and say that nobody has that viewpoint and you don't want to live with, you want to imagine a world in which that viewpoint does not exist. That's fine, but it does. And that's different than saying we're going to put something out there that nobody actually believes just for the clicks. I think that those two things, I think that that's a distinction that ultimately feeds into whether or not the piece is a piece that's valuable. Now, I also want to say in context, and I don't want to speak for Jody and Felissa, who never make mistakes and they're perfect, but we do tons of time. Like we make mistakes all the time. It's part of, we live in a little minute by minute publication. There's no way that there aren't going to be things that you look at, either you look at it the next day or you look at it the next year and you say, that's not what I wish I didn't publish that, or I wish I didn't publish it that way. And then you learn from it. But I do think that the larger conversation has gotten very, very radioactive, in part because social media highlights there are platforms that run on hot emotions. And it is, hot emotions by nature are great. They're motivating, they're activating, but they make cool and dispassionate engagement challenging. They're necessary, but they create challenge in some ways.
The way I think about all of this is just what, we live in a world of limited resources. Even if we all quadrupled our budgets, we would still live in a world where we had to make choices about what we're doing. And so when I think about what are we doing, right? What do people need from us? There's no shortage of hot takes, as Alana said. You walk into any room of Jews in real life or in the internet, like there are a lot of hot takes. I feel like if we don't add to that, if we don't necessarily reflect that, that's not the end of the world. What people need from us is reporting so that their hot takes can be more informed. And we need to take seriously the responsibility of getting our reporting in front of them and engaging them with it, around it, so that we're not, sending our reporting into a vacuum and the hot takes happen without being influenced. I also think there's a huge, Jody mentioned this when we started, first person essays, that is again something that Jewish media is uniquely positioned to elevate, that we're telling these broad narratives, individual stories can offer texture that is really useful, that teaches, does those two things that we're talking about, that allows people to see their own experiences reflected and gives them a window into someone who has a lot in common with them, but is also really different. And hopefully that leads to kinder conversations, or at least that's the idea and the dream. And that's kind of where our focus is.
Can I piggyback on that for a second, Gal? Because I think it goes back to actually your earlier question about kind of where do we think about Lashon Hara or pissing people off? And I do think it's really important to also always remember kind of who we are, which is journalists and journalism organizations. And I think, one of the reasons that I left the New York Times to come here was because I really believe that quality independent journalism is a pillar of democracy and of a kind of functioning community and society, and that Jews deserve that too. And that, to have, true kind of civically oriented, independent, heavily reported, truth-based, diverse voices and broad perspectives on the opinion section, those kinds of things that I think really do lead to a healthier society. So, but in that vein, there's a lot of Jewish advocacy groups out there, and there's a lot of Jewish leaders working to build their version of a better Jewish world. And that is great, but that is not who we are. We are really detached from that and trying to kind of independently assess and explain and explore all of that. And of course, it's different to be at a community publication versus, someplace like the New York Times. But if we become kind of part of that Jewish advocacy or Jewish service organization, nonprofit landscape, then the Jewish community has no independent reporting, observers, accountability outlets, and we deserve it and we need it.
Mm-hmm. But can you, and we'll move on from here in a second, but I am really curious to ask this, but is it like, what about traffic? Like, are you not, because everything, all the good stuff that you all three are describing, wanting to do, the stuff that comes from a good faith desire to provide the community with something that is a needed resource, has to sort of stand up to this drift towards paying attention to the numbers. And that's social media too. I mean, it's that bias, it pushes you in a certain direction. And, I think this isn't unique to Jewish journalism, but I see this at the New York Times. I mean, there is the journalistic mission, which always is supposed to be front and center, but then we get the numbers every day, and it would be foolish to think that individual reporters and editors aren't influenced by the sort of that feedback loop, in that sense that certain things do well, and you get rewarded for those things doing well. Either it's as an institution financially, or just personally as a reporter. So it sounds like everything you're describing involves pushing some of that away to some extent.
So, my last job at the New York Times was running the audience strategy. And so I was very focused on some of these questions. And broadly, we found something that I think Alana spoke to earlier too. So we found essentially there were two categories of stuff that did the best. The one category was really quick, and they now call it live journalism, news in the moment, which is essentially leaning into what the internet is talking about right now, whether that's because something has happened or because people are galvanizing around some meme or something, and really like coming quickly with something distinctive and of quality to a conversation that's already happening. But the other thing was the highest quality, longest developed projects, investigative, narrative, visual, video investigations that took the most time and that the newsroom itself was the most proud of. Those also drove huge audiences. And I think Alana's story about the French anti-Semitism is a good example of that. So maybe her timing was a little bit off, but certainly better to be too early than too late. And that thing is deep and long and important, and probably took a ton of commitment by the reporters and the editor to follow up and and it paid off because people want to read good, long, big, thoughtful things. Also, they really want both. You know what they don't want? They don't want what was the bread and butter of Metro dailies and frankly, the New York Times international desk for a lot of years, which is sort of stories that take a long time to produce and don't actually say much that's sort of surprising or new or
incremental stories.
They're sort of like blah. They're kind of in the middle. They're not what people are talking about right now. And they're not exciting or deep or new enough to get people talking about them. And those are the two things we have to focus on. We need to lean into the conversation people are already having and give them something to chew on in that conversation, as Felissa really smartly said about, make something to base their hot takes on. And we also need to say, hey, you know what? Look over here. You are not talking about this. You're not thinking about this, but it's important. And we found some stuff that you need to know. And we're going to tell you about it in a way that's accessible, that's compelling, that probably has great art with it. And we're going to get your attention and we're going to change the conversation and help you see the value of this thing. But this other thing that's 3 days late and kind of a little bit more information about the thing you were talking about, but now you've moved on from. So audiences don't want that, but it wasn't that good in the first place.
We just didn't know it because there were no metrics. It was just everyone.
Well, and you had all those
thought that they were the ones providing.
you were not. Look, the really exciting time about this moment in journalism is that the business interests are totally aligned with the audience interests and the journalism interests. We want to write things, create journalism, make things that people engage with and read and that has impact. And that's what drives subscriptions or traffic probably donations, because people are actually interested. It used to be that the business side was selling these advertisers on something. They didn't even like news. They didn't want their advertisers to be near any stories that like might be upsetting. And then there were all these pages in between the ad pages that needed to be filled. And they were filled with a lot of those basic beat stories where nothing much was going on, but they needed some extra stories between the good stuff on the front page and some of the other stuff like, obits or whatever.
Yeah. Alana, did you want to jump in or should I?
I mean, I just wanted to say that also I think that there's again, it's probably too early to talk about any of this because it's all stuff we're going to learn about in hindsight. But I also think that the internet's in a constant state of flux, and that what was true 5 years ago about clickbait and what was driving traffic is not true today. It's certainly not true for us at Tablet. So Tablet 7 years ago, 8 years ago, we published a piece on the fate of Hitler's toilet. We're not going to talk so much about it, but like, it was a lovely, I mean, it's just, okay, I won't actually pass judgment on the piece, but I will just say that obviously we're not talking about like an in-depth investigative piece of enormous length and reportage. And it was like our top piece for 2 years, maybe. I mean, like, it's something insane. The pieces now that are our most read pieces are not those quick hit pieces of drive-by fun stuff anymore. And I think that reflects the moment that we're in more broadly in America and the moment that we're in the world, that people are not coming to our outlets, I don't think, for clickbait. And I think that some of this is getting sussed out as we do it. Because the internet was kind of the Wild West and people were like, I don't know, maybe you're a department store and I can get everything here. I can get my blenders and school stuff for my kids or whatever. And we were like, I guess we have to give you everything. And now I think we're re-specializing and re-becoming more of what we each may want to be, or may have the capacity and the skills to be, as the landscape shifts and changes. So I think that part of this is like, it's a little bit, the verdict's still kind of open on this.
Right.
I would just add that yes to everything Jody said about understanding our audience. I think in the Jewish press, like, we have this gift of knowing a great deal. I mean, there's a big long chat if anybody's watching about the Pew study, which, like, we know a lot about our audience or our potential audience, and that allows us to come to conclusions like, well, this story, was read by 2,000 people, but we have a pretty good understanding that it was the right 2,000, and they're talking about it, and there's going to be, action inspired by it in the right community, right circles, and like, that's as exciting, maybe even more exciting to me as the editor than a story that goes crazy and is seen 200,000 times. That's also a thrill. We love when that happens. Lots of new people subscribe to our newsletters. We are introduced to lots of, people that we hope will become longtime readers, but the numbers are not, I don't know if there's anywhere at this time where the numbers are really actually the most important thing. They really do, people have a lot of feelings about them. I don't know if there's anywhere where they really matter that much. But we know enough to be able to make those, distinctions, which I think is really helpful.
I want to get to the Q&A, but I just want to ask one question, which is actually not a very quick question, but I'm looking for a quick answer so we can get to some of the things people want to talk about. But I'm curious about Israel and how you're thinking through covering Israel at the moment when there does seem to be, it just seems silly to ignore the fact that there is some kind of generational divide happening in terms of people's just basic acceptance of Israel's existence, and it's troubling to a lot of people, but you have to cover the conflict, you have to cover what's going on there. How do you think through how to do that in a way that sort of is consistent with your institution's values? Or we can move on to
I think that Tablet's helped here by its identity as a magazine, where magazines traditionally, and just to highlight the way that I see it, like, a newspaper was a hot medium and a magazine was a cool medium. Newspapers, you were supposed to get your newspaper, read it, throw it down on your kitchen table and do something. Go to a vote for somebody or vote somebody out. Go to a school board meeting. Go protest to get your traffic light fixed or something even more important. Magazines were more contemplative, and they were, or certainly the monthlies and the more the thought leader magazines were cooler mediums. And they were also eccentric. So if you can think back, when there were thought leader magazines like the New Yorker, Harper's, the Atlantic, they all had their own specific collection of weirdos. Like their readers, if you were a New Yorker reader, you weren't a Harper's reader. Those were two different kinds of weird people or interesting people, or whatever way you want to put it. Now, of course, one of the things the internet does is it flattens everything. So everybody can read the New Yorker and Harper's and the Atlantic and pick and choose, and it's all, but what it also means is that things start to sound the same. I think that tablet sort of exists more in the universe of an eccentric magazine, which has certain ideas that it finds compelling, that it wants to explore, and other ideas that it's not interested in. Or the people who write and edit tablet feel drawn to versus not drawn to. So Zionism in Israel ends up being put through that same distillery that we put everything through. Do we find that argument compelling or interesting to us? Do we think it's being made better elsewhere? And that's how we see it. We feel like Zionism, and actually I would say that there are a lot of questions also about America and the American democracy and American civic life, that the conversation around Zionism the last 5 years prepared us for. Like, how far are we willing to question things? How far are we willing to take them? What do you find interesting and not? And then chasing what you find interesting and compelling and what you think you can do well. So that's how we see it, but we also have some benefits of a specific posture that we're able to take.
And I would say that we, and someone asked about, how are we different? Here's the way we're different. We have a challenge posed by our history as a wire service, because we know there's great news by Israeli media about what's happening in Israel. And we know that our readers who are inclined to or wanting to know that information are getting it. So we don't need to be providing, the brief about this rocket flew, or, this argument was had in Knesset. Like, that's something that we historically have done, and like nobody is really served by that. Maybe Jody and the Forverts and our client publications, but readers generally, like, we know that if someone is inclined toward knowing the granular details of what's happening in Israel, like, they have so many opportunities to get it, which is a wonderful thing for American Jews. So what do we do instead? We're looking toward explanatory content. Can we do more to cover what it's like to be a Jew in Israel rather than all these other things? Like, that seems pretty important. A lot of Jews in the world live in Israel, and that's a story that I think American readers, benefit from understanding. I think this is a really challenging topic, and the best way through, as with all challenges, is through journalism. So reporting about the questions and debates and fights and pain and excitement and all of the things that are floating around here, rather than having a particular perspective. Because both as journalists, but also as Jews, it's impossible to have a particular perspective. Like, there are so many, we know that, represented among our readership and among the people we cover. So good journalism that's different from how we've historically done it, that's a pretty big change that's happening right now at JTA.
So Gal, I actually think I have a really simple answer to your complicated question, which is we cover the change. Like, change is and honestly, I think, when I spent 4 years as the Jerusalem bureau chief in New York Times from 2012 through 2015. And it wasn't it was one of my biggest challenges was how cyclical and the same everything seemed. And one of the things we've found in general over the 5 years since then, but I think specifically around the last Gaza war, is the shift in discourse. And we wrote a lot of really important stories about the different ways you could trace the shift in discourse among politicians, among Jewish institutions, on social media. And those were really interesting stories. So our responsibility is to chronicle that change, to explain that change, to understand that change. And look, there are two parts of your question. I thought my answer would be shorter as well as simple. Sorry. Look, I feel like there's one part of the generational change, and Pew has documented this, is less interest in Israel. So that's a particular kind of challenge. There's another part of the conversation of what your question posed, which really is a changed view of Israel that's generational. Many young people who are anti-Zionist are deeply interested in this conversation. So that's, so that shift, that generational change, that generational gap, the inability or the struggles of people to talk to their grandchildren and children about this, or to grapple with how they're to rethink their own views based on their the younger generation's views is super interesting, and both generations are really interested in it.
Right. Thank you. It takes me back to the initial question of sort of what is essential for American Jews about what you produce. And when you said, Jody, about, writing about the change discourse, like that was a moment for me, in the Gaza war, where I really wanted to read what all three of your publications were producing on that question, because it was a kind of a personally troubling moment for me, where I felt the ground shifting, and the New York Times wasn't going to really cover it, besides, maybe a cursory story. I'm going to take one question from the Q&A, because I think it's an important question. It's an interesting one to end on. And I'm sorry that I couldn't take more, but one of our viewers, Alan Dibak, wants to know about the economic viability of the Jewish press going forward. And I think it is an important place to end on. All of those, he's saying all of those on the panel rely to an extent on philanthropy. Is this sustainable in the long term? Sorry, not an upper, but but I think it's important, given that we've established over the last hour how essential it is.
The short answer is we don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I mean, if Jody and Felissa may have more insight into this than I do, but I don't. We just don't know. This universe it moves too fast and shifts too much. For any of us, I think, to be sure. Is there any universe in which we could say, oh, it's absolutely guaranteed, this is great, we're going to be fine for the rest of all of our careers? That would be, I think, really not smart for any of us to say. That said, I think beyond that, it's very, very, very hard to know. I do think that asking yourself that question, asking the question of the other ancillary question, but one that I think is concerning to me, is, when readers were a big part of the economic model of an outlet, when subscriptions were a part of the economic model of the outlet, the emotional attachment that people had to your outlet was thicker and more involved. And that created some complications, but it also created sustainability in a way and sustainability not only financially, but also emotionally. And you were in it with them. And that's, the challenge is even bigger. Even if somebody could say to us, you are all going to financially be supported philanthropically for the next 50 years, then we have another problem, which is, what is our reader connection to us? Right. And how do we actually make that strong again? And I think that's, so they're connected, but also in many ways separate challenges that at least we think about, or I think about in the same breath.
So I appreciate you asking the question, because it gives us a chance to make our pitch. It's really important. And I
that was not the intention, but go ahead.
So if anyone wants to come to the Forverts virtual gala on October 20th and support us, that would be great. But no, look, I talked earlier about journalism as an essential part of functioning democracy and a civic life. And the model I really believe in for Jewish journalism now is a philanthropic model that is based both on grassroots donations and bigger investments by organized philanthropists or by wealthy individuals, that is very similar to the model you might see in a community around a library or a hospital or the opera, things that people believe a community needs. And the Jewish community needs independent journalism, and people need to fund it in the same way, because it won't be there if they don't. And I think, Alana, the one thing I would quibble with what Alana said is the idea that our model is that our economics are not dependent on readers. Now, I think they're more dependent on readers than ever. Some of that is through, for those who have subscriptions or individual donations, but also just in that the reader patterns, the behavior of readers fuel all of our economics. They are our incentives and how we talk about things. And any journalism model right now is dependent on serving readers well. And I think that is good for the business and good for readers. And I'm excited about the possibilities that open up. And one thing I'll say is last year, at a time of, where I think everybody understood that news was really essential, and readership at the Forward and all of our publications and at every publication in America went way up, the number of gifts to the Forward, the number of donations doubled from 2019. And many of those were $18 here or there. But that was readers saying, we need what you're doing. We believe in what you're doing. We're depending on you. We are developing an emotional connection and a relationship with you. And I just, right before this call, I got like an auto email from someone who had made some donation in my honor. And the note was hilarious. It was this note that was like, in honor of the ways Jody Jordan is changing the Forward River, I'm sorry for the criticism I had lodged, months ago or something. I had to go back and look up. It was a very minor criticism, but that's about emotional resonance and emotional connection and dollars. And it's important. But yes, we need the community, whether that's individual readers, whether that's a philanthropy that is small, whether it's Craig Newmark who's supporting us and other journalism organizations at a very high level, but we need all of that to sustain ourselves. That is the model that is going to work going forward. And certainly Ilana's right that there's no guarantees here, but there's a lot of promise and a lot of hope, I think.
Do you want to chime in at all, Felissa? You don't.
I do want to chime in. I agree with everything said, but I want to chime in anyway, because I want to offer everyone here the opportunity to know that we have lots of ways that readers can engage with us, and that emotional resonance is something. I'm a little distracted because I just found out this very second that I have a new nephew, this very second. So popped up on my screen. But yes, I think, our struggles in the sustainability space are not different from the rest of the media landscape. It's a very difficult time. There's a lot of exciting efforts underway to figure out a solution. I agree with Jody totally that philanthropy is the most promising model. That doesn't mean it's borne itself out yet. And that having, the risks that may come from that of drawing resources from the people you cover can be mitigated by drawing resources from lots of people you cover, including all of your readers, and creating opportunities and building that engagement is, so important. And then I would just say that the best thing to do is really great work, because nobody will want to support something other than that. And so the attraction to a hot take or whatever it is that's, the cheap readership, that's not our path to sustainability. And then I would just add, because I saw a comment in the chat, that local Jewish media faces it's a little bit different, and something that we're thinking a lot about, and I know Jody and the Forward also are thinking about, is how can we be part of the solution so that local communities can have the Jewish journalism that they need, because we are all connected, but we also have individual local lived experiences, and the disappearance of that would be a tragedy for the Jewish people. So this is work that we're very engaged in too.
Right. Well, I have 15 more questions, and I see the Q&A is full of questions, but unfortunately we have to stop there. But it's obviously a rich conversation that I think touches on so many, it's a lens through which, we get to all the bigger issues in the Jewish community and all the things that we're thinking about sort of outside even the boundaries of journalism, because it does feel so important. So thank you, Alana, Jody, Felissa. It was great to see you guys. And I hope everyone has enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks to Evo.
Thank you.